My family began attending St. Andrew's Chapel in Sanford, Florida, when I was 6 years old. We did not leave until shortly after my 13th birthday. In the 7 years that I spent at St. Andrew's, I was left irreparably traumatized by spiritual abuse perpetrated by the leaders, namely Pastor Burk Parsons. My family and I are not Parsons's only victims. Despite more than 10 years of corruption, abuse, and destruction, Parsons continues to hold authority in teaching positions, board and conference seats, and editing roles for Christian literature. As of November 2024, Parsons began being investigated by the PCA for vaguely described violations of his pastoral vows. However, he was already investigated for spiritual abuse in 2018 and received but a slap on the wrist for his offenses. Due to the nature of these offenses, Parsons is not eligible to hold any role of spiritual authority, as God does not take his name being attached to abuse lightly. God has equipped me to act, and in making this video, I am obeying his call. I am aware that the public reception to this video will be unfavorable. There are many people still loyal to Parsons who will say that publicly sharing my story is unbiblical and violates Matthew 18. But let us be clear on something before we proceed. Scripture shows the Matthew 18 approach is for offenses in personal relationships, not offenses perpetrated by a pastor against a sheep. We know this because 1 Timothy 5:20 outlines how we are to handle accusations against leaders and states that they are to be rebuked publicly so that the others may take warning. The PCA has not done this, as they have not publicly revealed any details of the spiritual abuse perpetrated by Parsons. I'm also aware that many will attempt to defend Parsons in the way that many abusive pastors have been defended before in the public eye. Quote, "The author of Psalms was a murderer and adulterer, and this man is but another sinner." Let us be very clear. David was indeed a murderer and an adulterer. But do you know what sin David didn't commit? The sin of spiritual abuse. Harming, abusing, and traumatizing the Lord's people, all while attaching his name to it, is an infinitely more serious sin than others. The sin of spiritual abuse is not present in any of the writers of the Bible, and to suggest that God views wolves devouring his sheep in the same way he views the sinful, saved men of the Bible is an attack to the character of God. Spiritual abusers are the enemy's greatest weapon against God's kingdom, and that weapon is strengthened when people continue to defend and honor such teachers. Let us not forget that those who crucified Christ were not prostitutes or murderers, but were spiritual abusers in the church. This video is a call for accountability, it is a call for truth, and it is a call for God's people at last to receive justice. I'm hoping that in my sharing of my own experiences, this will encourage other victims to speak out, as I'm sure that there are many similar stories to mine. It goes without saying, but I am going to remain anonymous in this video, as my privacy has been invaded quite enough from the things that happened at this church. With that out of the way, let's get into the heart of the video. Now, just so we're clear on where this church is, who the pastors involved are, this is the church St. Andrew's Chapel, founded by the late R.C. Sproul, who is an icon within the Reformed and Presbyterian denominations, and to this day still remains a prominent and looked-to figure for theology in those groups. By the time I attended, R.C. Sproul rarely preached due to health issues and aging, so Pastor Burk Parsons was the primary teacher and preacher for most of the time. St. Andrew's Chapel is also home to the online Reformed ministry that many are aware of, Legalism. With that context out of the way, let's get into my personal experience and story. In the year 2010, my family began attending Sunday services and Wednesday night fellowships at the church. As we pulled into the parking lot on our first Sunday, I remember being in awe of the size of the building. The giant steeple overlooked a massive lake with a fountain, and there were trees all over the property. As my family all headed to the chapel itself for service, families poured in, but all conversations were but a gentle murmur in the tall room. Carved stone poles stretched from floor to ceiling, and stained glass adorned each wall, sending colored beams of sun onto the wooden pews. The pulpit was up a set of stairs in the center, with choir seats that climbed high in front of the centerpiece of stained glass. To the right of this area sat three wooden chairs that resembled thrones. The decorations and architecture were so grand that the church almost seemed like a royal castle to me as a child. It's hard to believe that such a beautiful place turned out to have so much evil inside it. We walked through the pews and took our seat. We stood to sing hymns that were written in thick Old English from the red hymnals provided in each pew. After we sang words that I struggled to pronounce, a man in a long, flowy robe stepped up to the wooden podium, Pastor Burk Parsons. As he began to teach, he used such complex vocabulary that it seemed he was talking in another language altogether. I didn't know what exactly he was talking about, but I did know the way that he grimaced and furrowed his brow when he spoke meant that it wasn't something good. His tone made me think that whatever he was talking about was something I should feel afraid of. And so I did feel afraid. Though I had yet to experience any of the deep spiritual abuse that came later, I felt one thing for certain as I stared at the podium and his voice echoed through the building. Church wasn't the happy place I thought it was, after all. Church was no longer a celebration, it was a funeral. It was a place where grim news was given from a man who was very important, so important that he had a big robe and sat on one of the throne-like chairs on the right. The message was clear. He was high, and I was not. As I grew a little older, 7 and 8, I was able to understand the general ideas of Burke's sermons, and I wasn't surprised to realize his words matched his facial expressions perfectly. There was a repeated, strong emphasis on hell, wrath, and sin. God's holiness was emphasized, but the consequential love, compassion, and grace that are integral to God's holiness were not. This was whiplash to what I had thought to be true prior to attending the church. My picture of God had been loving, faithful, and relentless in his pursuit of me. In home videos at age 5, I can be seen singing and dancing to Chris Tomlin's Indescribable with a toothless grin. Never in my life had I associated God with fear, but that rapidly began to change as I sat under Burke's preaching, and occasionally R.C. Sproul's preaching. The God I now knew was an angry God, full of wrath and hate towards sinners, which I knew from the relentless drilling of that point included me. On a basic level, I knew a pastor was meant to represent God to God's people. If the man who was supposed to be closer to God than we were was this foreboding, I was terrified to think about what God himself must have been like. I didn't dare question Burke's authority, and I didn't consider for even a second that maybe he wasn't the man of great holiness he presented himself to be. To question him felt like questioning God himself. That was how inseparable the two were in my mind. A passage that was preached on frequently was Luke 16:19 through 31, the passage of the dead rich man Lazarus speaking to Abraham. These messages were especially disturbing to me as a child, as the leaders loved to emphasize the horror of the passage, the hellfire, the longing, the desperation of dying without knowing Christ, but neglected on touching on the grace that saved us from that horror. Let me be clear. I do not think it is spiritually abusive to discuss sin, hell, or God's wrath, as these are legitimate topics in the Bible, and we know these things are true and real. However, the manner in which these topics were discussed was spiritually abusive. When a pastor laser focuses sermons on sin, hell, and wrath without constantly pointing to Christ and our rescue from those things, it does not build up those who hear such preaching in the grace of the gospel. It instead instills fear. That was the running theme with all the sermons preached at the church, heaping conviction and guilt onto congregants while the grace of the gospel gathered dust on a shelf. These fear-based teachings were defended by all the leaders' manipulative claims that Jesus talked more about hell than heaven, so they were only doing what was biblical by preaching so much on it. However, that claim is widely disputed by scholars, and even if it is accurate, its existence is not God giving pastors the green light to pile heavy burdens on the shoulders of his flock, which neither the flock nor the pastors can lift, which is exactly what their teachings did. Guilt is meant to point us to our Savior, but the church put us in a pit of guilt and left us there. It's no surprise that within a couple years of attending St. Andrews, I developed OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder has a lot of wrong stereotypes, mainly that it's primarily about germs, but it can really be about anything. And lo and behold, my top theme was religious things. I was constantly convinced that God was angry at me, that I was going to hell, and sitting under the teachings that I did week after week just compounded that fear into my head. It was not abnormal for Sunday's preaching to include other types of churches and Christians being talked about and disdained for being worldly. But the definition of worldly in the church was worlds different from the biblical perspective. It was extremist, legalistic, and spiritually abusive. Fun was demonized. Enjoyment was demonized. Any form of church or Christianity that looked different from the sanitized, traditional, pure form of worship presented by the church was demonized. A sermon that had really hammered the idea that fun was ungodly was one where Burk shamed a couple from the pulpit that were new to the church and had come to him after service, saying they had wished that the children's learning activities had been more fun. His demeanor as he recounted this statement was so grim and full of vitriol that, isolated from what they had really said, you would have thought the parents had confessed to him that they killed someone after service. That was how abhorrent the idea of church and fun going together was to Burke. I always hoped the couple had not come back that following Sunday, because if they had, the shame that they felt must have been immense, and they would have felt so humiliated. The demonizing of these God given gifts, like fun and enjoyment, harmed both the adults and children who heard it, but harmed the children most of all, as these things are central to being a child. Being a child means having fun. Being a child means finding enjoyment in everything. Being a child means not being concerned with rigidity, but not if you were a child growing up at St. Andrews. Children were expected to sit in adult services with the scholarly minds of adults, which was evident when a member scoffed at my mother for voicing concern on the complexity of Burke's teachings. Okay, what? Should we dumb down the teachings for them then? She asked. I experienced the full brunt of this mentality in the homeschooling groups we began attending in our first or second year. The mothers who ran the group were very particular on the sort of material that was used to teach, and repeatedly gave me work to do that was grades and grades above anything I could possibly understand. Now, I was never the sharpest knife in the drawer when it came to school. However, I was expected to learn literal high school level grammar as well as advanced Latin at only 8 or 9 years old. It became evident over time that children were viewed as problems to be solved. This us versus them mentality the leaders created between parents and their children was solidified as a panel speaker, Vadi Bakum, referred to babies as vipers in diapers. These expectations of children are not normal, and it is incredibly abusive to criticize children for being childish. Jesus cherished and protected children in their vulnerability and said, "Let the children come to me." The church did not treat children as though they were those whom the kingdom of heaven belonged to. Instead, the church treated children as though their natural state was at extreme enmity with God and in need of ironing out. Eventually, my family began attending both the morning and the evening services at church. I was so filled with dread about going back that I would beg my parents every week if we could stay home just that once. Morning services had at least contained some things I could look forward to beforehand, like getting a plastic water cup from the courtyard and filling it with tadpoles from the pond, or grabbing one of the tiny coffee creamers and drinking it in the bathroom. For evening service, I struggled to find the silver lining. Getting condemned in the morning service was hard enough even with those things. So getting condemned in the evening service with one, no tadpoles, and two, no coffee creamer was a hard pass for me at 8 years old. Double the services meant I learned twice as much about what, at the time, I thought were absolute truths and facts about life. I started to notice a growing theme with the sermons. Pulpit shaming. I have been personally shamed from the pulpit by Burk Parsons, and I am not the only one who has been shamed from the pulpit by Burk Parsons. I'll start with my story and then explain the other ones that I witnessed, though I'm sure there are more that I either don't remember or wasn't there for. But first, to understand what happened to me in the shaming, you need to understand the background. When I was 4 years old, I was molested by a trusted family member. This molestation affected me in many ways throughout my life, including look at adult content at a young age. I didn't like what I was seeing. In fact, it actually scared me, but I felt like I couldn't look away. Eventually, I felt so guilty that I told my parents, and they were understandably distraught. So they reached out to the elders, who recommended that they talk to the pastor, Pastor Burk Parsons. I never heard what was said in the meeting, as it was just my parents and the pastor, but I assumed it went fine since I hadn't heard anything else after that. However, in one of the following Sundays, my stomach dropped when I heard the sermon end with Pastor Parsons talking about a story of parents that came to him distraught over their 8-year-old daughter watching pornography on the family device. It wasn't just the fact that he had no permission in any shape or form to share that story, it was the fact that he said it in such a light that made it sound so despicable, and I felt despicable after hearing it. Despite the fact that I wasn't named, I was convinced that people would put together that I was the girl in the sermon. The oldest sister of one of my best friends at the time had figured out it was me. A super active Instagram account suddenly going dead, combined with the details in the sermon, didn't make it very hard to put together who the sermon was about. He had repeatedly teased me and asked me, had I done something bad? I felt humiliated. It baffles me that the response to what I went through as a child, which was a result of sexual abuse, was treated in such a manner that I was some sort of black sheep and that I was this deplorable, dirty person. I felt as though I was marked by darkness and that there was something especially wrong with me, more than there was with other people. I was not the only person that's been shamed from the pulpit. I've already mentioned a couple that came to the pastor and was inquiring about more fun learning activities for their kids being shamed. But unfortunately, I witnessed other instances of pulpit shaming as well. One year, around Christmas time, it became a tradition for members to buy different kinds of soaps from Bath and Body Works and give them to each other as a kind of like church gift exchange. Pastor Parsons had got up onto the pulpit and shamed people who were participating in this, saying, "Who do we think we are, kings and queens buying Bath and Body Works?" Moving on to the last example I can remember, it was understood that there was a standard for the way one should be dressed to attend service, and that those who didn't fit that standard should feel ashamed of themselves. In a sermon that I remember for the worst reasons, Burke had shamed families from the pulpit that came to Sunday service in jeans instead of costly attires. He did not name them by name, but obviously the families that were wearing jeans were shamed by that. He stood there and judged families who likely came in the best they could afford while making a comfortable salary from the abundance of tithes and offerings, on top of his numerous positions in other St. Andrew's related ministries. This standard for how things should look bled into other areas as well, as the church did not treat families with disabilities the same way that they treated regular families. In order to protect my identity, I cannot expand on the specifics of these comments or who they were directed to. However, I can confirm that I have witnessed ableism perpetrated both by leaders and congregants at St. Andrew's Chapel. Ableism is a massive problem within this church, and disabled people are not treated as those who are given special honor, as it is said in Corinthians, but are treated as those who are outcasts, those whose needs are not valued or considered, but are neglected and treated as an afterthought. To summarize, Pastor Parsons is not a man of God. He is not a godly pastor, and he is not a shepherd that should be trusted. He, instead, fits the description of what Jesus describes the Pharisees to be: one who shuts the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, one who puts so much emphasis on tradition but neglects the more important matters of the law, like justice, mercy, and faithfulness. A blind guide who strains out a gnat but swallows a camel. One who does everything he does for people to see and to receive honor, making his garment ornate and long, loving the high seat of honor in the synagogue. I cannot help but think of the throne-like chairs which the pastors sit on during the service at St. Andrew's. These are the descriptions of Pharisees, and Pharisees, above all else, are spiritual abusers. And God is not happy with how this wolf has devoured his flock time and time again. It must stop. If you or someone you know has gone through a similar experience, I encourage you to share it in the comments below or even publicly online. And if this video reaches the leader that it centers on, you can still do the right thing and resign. In John 6:37, Jesus says whoever comes to him he will most certainly not cast out. It doesn't matter what you've done or how messy this has become, you are still not too far gone for the grace of God, and you're not too far gone to turn around.